Good morning. How are you, everybody? It is our Sunday service time. Nice to be with you. I'm Wayne and Lisa is here. Hey, Lisa, how are you?
Very good. Enjoying the garden.
Right, so that might be a topic of discussion. And David is with us again. Thanks for joining us, David.
Well, g'day to you, Wayne, and g'day to you, Lisa.
Yes, Family Voice Australia and the Monarchist League is where David represents, and he's been away for a couple of weeks, but great to have you back. I thought rather than this Sunday service, that instead of being theological, we might become botanical.
Ah, yes.
Very interesting.
All botany is theology, really, when you boil it down.
Yes, well, it all began in a garden, didn't it? The Garden of Eden.
Exactly.
And so there's some symbolisms that we want to bring. So spring has sprung, Lisa, and your garden at home looks magnificent.
It certainly does. Of course, we do have to do the weeds, unfortunately.
Yes, there's a bit of that, but we are going to have a look. Spring is this week. It starts on the 1st of September, and there is a special significance and a lot of symbolism in flowers and in plants. And we're going to talk about the many different biblical references to botany. It is, in fact, one of the key subjects of the Bible, and surprising, we don't hear very much taught on it. So David is going to assist us in bringing us a botanical view of our Sunday service today. Looking forward to that, David.
Well, thank you, Wayne. And of course, it's National Wattle Day coming up on the 1st of September, the first day of spring, just a couple of days away.
And that is a very interesting discussion, the wattle. What does it mean? What is its symbolism in Australia? And what are the spiritual significances of flowers? It is a good topic to get into. It is a beautiful topic. It is a colourful topic. We're looking forward to it here on the Sunday service. Our Sunday service and something beautiful, some beautiful flowers that are springing forth. Our gardens are full of them, and David and Lisa, it is a beautiful time of the year, and we often say in Christian circles that this is a time where God's creation is so much in splendour. It's so beautiful to see. But we do know that there are a lot of biblical references, and in what might have been such harsh times over thousands of years, where wars and so forth are depicted, and the times of kings and so on are talked about in the Bible, that there are these beautiful pictures of flowers.
This is true. So Jesus referred us to the flowers. He said that we should consider them. I wonder how many parents and grandparents say that to their children or grandchildren. Let's go and look at the flowers,
Yes.
and deduce some theology from them. That's exactly what Jesus did.
And it says, and why do you worry about clothes? Consider how the lilies of the field grow. They do not labour or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his glory was adorned like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is where here today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith?
And what that means is that the glory of the flowers, and they'll be springing, especially now that spring is almost upon us, the glory of the flowers is prophetic of God's love for his people and how he wishes to clothe them more gloriously than we can imagine. And so Solomon only glimpsed that glory in the fine splendour with which he was clothed, because you can't gild the lily, as they say, and how to improve on those wonderful plants that are out there. What a wonderful thing it is when we take time to go and look at nature and marvel at the created beauty, which speaks to us about God's character.
It certainly does.
Isaiah 35, Lisa, is about a desert, and a desert that springs forth life.
Yes, this is giving us hope, and actually it's referring to the future glory of Zion, but it also can be referring to us here in Australia, because we are in what you call a very remote area in the broadcast areas that we're serving. The wilderness and the wasteland shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the excellence of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the excellency of our God.
Beautiful.
Our country cousins have an advantage over us city dwellers, of course, Wayne and Lisa, because they get to see creation. Whereas in the city, people who are stuck in apartment buildings, they might have a little flower pot. That's about it. And if they look out of the window, they'll just often see pollution. There are many people in the world that have never seen the stars. They live in cities that are so polluted now, and also many cities are very cloudy, especially in the equatorial regions, and it's a great pleasure for me when I bring African visitors to look around to the outback of Australia. They're utterly gobsmacked to look up and see the stars. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. That's when we look up, but when we look down we see the flowers, and they too have their part to play.
And what a beautiful, it's just a beautiful calm that provides for us, to our soul, when we are given flowers. Flowers are just amazing. They can be used for every occasion, can't they?
Yes, very much so.
Yes, I once visited a lady who was shut up in her room, wouldn't receive any visitors. She wouldn't even leave the room to go to the bathroom. She would use a bucket. And I thought, well, how can I break through here? And I had this revelation from the Lord. I just dashed down to the shop, bought a bunch of flowers. I came back and I said to her mother, I've got these flowers for your daughter. Will she receive them? The mother goes into the room and says, he's got some flowers for you. Will you receive them? All right. So that was the entry into the room to be able to minister to her.
And I was in Ballarat in this very time of the year, the spring time, and they have a botanical garden there which has got the busts of all of the Australian Prime Ministers. Each one you can go along, and they have if you like, a statue and an inscription about them. But in that same garden is the most beautiful array of flowers. It is such that you can't begin to imagine. I took a photo of myself.
Australian natives?
Natives, but also all English flowers too, gladiolas, daisies, just the most beautiful picture. And even myself, as maybe non-photogenic as I am, looked good with all that beautiful colour behind me. It was one of those times where you take a photo and you think it's the floral exhibition that you are really seeing in the creation there. Now, I want to talk a little bit as we move about with this particular reference of flowers in the Bible, and some of them are herbs like mint and so on. They're mentioned in the Bible. Others are like hyssop, which was a mixture of a bitter type, I guess the sap from a bitter plant that was given in a type of a medicinal purpose back in that time. And then other plants are like the rose of Sharon, which may well be a hibiscus. If we look at what does flower along the coastal regions of Israel today, the hibiscus tends to be more native to that region.
And of course, Jesus was referred to as the Rose of Sharon, so there was obviously a message in that, wasn't there?
Yeah, very much a connection, and the connection for us, which we're going to come back and talk about, is the wattle and the symbolism of the wattle in Australia. David's got more for us here on the Sunday service. It's our Sunday service this morning. Rather than being theological, we're being botanical. And David DeLima from Family Voice Australia and the Australian Monarchist League, and Lisa J and Wayne with you as we have a look at the first day of September. Now, this is a very interesting one. We've had Daffodil Day, which has been the spray of yellow flowers. The Cancer Council of Australia and the different state branches have been fundraising this week.
It's very much marketed.
It is, isn't it? And very much a important day for looking at what is a significant issue around Australia. There are different types of cancers, and I know that we have other days for other specific areas, but this is a general fundraiser day. But there is a day that is on Australia's calendar that our Australian Parliament House.gov.au actually has a web page dedicated to, and it is the Australian Wattle Day. Now, please explain this to me, David.
I will be pleased to do so. Back in 1899, and we give a shout out to our listeners in Victoria for this, a wattle club was formed to promote our famous green and gold flowering plant as a symbol of patriotism and love for the country. But it wasn't until 1910 that we had the first Wattle Day, and it only became official from the 1st of September 1992, so that's an important anniversary just this year, of course. Now, in 1912, the Commonwealth coat of arms was renewed, and a stylised image of golden wattle was incorporated. So this is as close as pocket or purse, of course, as we reach in for the 50-cent coin, because the 50-cent coin contains the Commonwealth coat of arms, and they've had to kind of compress it a little bit, including the tail of the kangaroo, just to fit in. But if you grab yourself a 50-cent coin, this is good advice for grandparents giving a little bit of pocket money to the kids. Just hold on to it, and as they try to prize it out of your hand, you could say, now, what plant is this? Recalling those instructions of Jesus to consider the lilies. In this case, the wattle, I suppose. If wattle grew in Israel, he might have suggested that plant. But nevertheless, to look at these things and consider them is very important, because the golden wattle has figured really strongly in our national history. Back in the First World War, 1914, gum leaves and sprigs of the golden wattle were often included with letters to the soldiers in the First World War. It was a reminder of things loved at home.
Yeah.
And then in 1954, the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II visited Australia for that great tour. So many Aussies came out to see her and the Duke, and she presented herself to us as Queen of Australia, as she always does when she arrives, but particularly so wearing this glorious wattle dress. And I do encourage the listeners to Google that. If you just type in Queen of Australia or Queen Elizabeth wattle dress, you'll see the magnificently young, fresh-faced
It's simply
Queen,
stunning, isn't it, David?
and the dress with the green and gold. She wore it on the first day of her tour and also on the last day, but I imagine it's never been worn since, and I'm scratching my head to think about when in the future, Lord willing, another Queen of Australia might wear that dress. You've got to be youthful enough to fit into it. So we'll have to wait and see who may perhaps one day wear that afresh and present herself to us as Queen. And then the green and gold, which are the colours from the wattle, they became our official national colours. Now, it's about 100 years ago since Australian athletes have been using those colours, but only officially since 1984. And then only as recently as 1988 was the golden wattle proclaimed as the national flower. But here we are on the brink of yet another National Wattle Day, which will come and go unless we're careful to mark it. And I do encourage people to go out and find some wattle. It doesn't have to be the golden wattle, but it could be the Flinders Ranges wattle or any wattle or any native plant for that purpose, and just put that on the dining table, and when kids or grandkids are there, just to ask them about that and just share some of these truths about how valuable that's been to shape our national identity. And though we're kind of replacing theology with biology, apparently Wayne is suggesting, you can't really do that, of course, because, as I said earlier, all biology really is theology when it's rightly understood. And how wonderful it is that so many of our plants give testimony. The wattle is the first plant to spring to life after a flood or a fire. That just reminds me of Jesus as the firstborn from the dead. And more than that, the wattle, because it's the first plant to spring to life, it shelters other plants as they're struggling, after the flood and after the fire. And how wonderful that is that Christ is our shelter as we are struggling to reach maturity ourselves.
It's a beautiful metaphor, David, when you think about, you were saying how they used the wattle to be able to encourage the soldiers in the First and Second World War. And I think that is interesting phenomenon of the wattle is the smell, the aroma that is literally is so strong, and I think that would also remind them of their homeland. And I think it's interesting. The power of flowers is just beautiful.
It's the scent of the acacia is actually what you're smelling with the wattle. And you made a little reference to that dress. And if people go into Australia's Parliament House today, there's a portrait on the wall of Parliament House of Queen Elizabeth painted in that wattle dress. And that is, it's a magnificent painting. And I've just put it up on our screens for us to see it there, of her sitting with that beautiful dress, the wattle dress that she wore. And of course, her in that blue sash when she appeared in 1954. And the symbolism of this plant for us is that the wattle was actually used by Indigenous people, and they used it in medicinal purposes too. So it's important to recognise that the species that was used for fuel also, and even some wattles were used for food. So, interestingly enough, very interesting conversation about the wattle. The first day of September is the Wattle Day in Australia.
Yes, Wayne, and I love this connection you're making with the crown. There's a lovely little poem that comes back from the First World War, Wattle Day, 1916. Here it is. And wear your spray of wattle, as a monarch wears his crown. Its native gold through testing fires has won to high renown.
Beautiful words here on our Sunday service, reflecting on the importance of God's creation and his plants, the botany that he has left for us to reflect his majestic nature, and we talk about that here on the Sunday service. Sunday service reflecting on the beauty of God's creation and the flowers that bloom and that are spoken of literally throughout the Bible. And we read those not only in the Old Testament part, but the New Testament part too, and the uses of herbs and different flowering plants. And it is interesting because on Easter Sunday, traditionally the church would adorn the church with floral displays. But through the time leading up to Easter, which some churches will still refer to as Lent, they would have no floral displays in their churches, and as a sign of new life, that churches would be displayed with floral arrangements on the Sunday service that is Easter Sunday. So just an interesting thought, and David, an interesting thought about the colours of each of our states. The golden wattle, the green, which reflects in our beautiful green and gold that our Australian athletes wore at the Commonwealth Games recently.
Yes.
But also each state has its own flower.
This is true, and we really need to celebrate this a lot more. Not because of rivalry, but because we're proud to be a South Australian or a Victorian or a New South Welshman or whatever it might be. So for New South Wales, of course, it's the Waratah, and that's a glorious red colour. I wonder if that might connect with the Red Cross of Christ, which is on the state badge of New South Wales. And then in Queensland, we've got the Cooktown Orchid. It's honouring Captain Cook. Although his name is Mud in many circles, it's very wrong for that attitude to be taken. We need to rejoice in our heritage. And so that beautiful purple plant for Queensland is the Cooktown Orchid.
And actually, when you say that, David, there is people up in the Pitjantjatjara area, the Indigenous communities up there, that actually love the whole concept of this beautiful relationship with flowers and God's creation.
Indeed. And so the wonderful Sturt Desert Pea, it has an Indigenous name that I love to share with people because it does look like the eye of the kangaroo,
yes.
And that's exactly what it is called in the Pitjantjatjara language, malu kuru, malu meaning kangaroo and kuru meaning eye. So when first the Indigenous people saw that plant, they said, well, it looks like the eye of a kangaroo, the kuru of the malu.
Yes.
Beautiful.
So I'd love for us to use that name a little more and celebrate our Indigenous heritage. And then Tasmania, the Tasmanian blue gum, lovely flower down there in the Apple Isle. And for Victoria, the common heath, which is a purple kind of colour as well. And then a very lovely one for Western Australia, the kangaroo paw, which is a lovely green and purple plant there for our friends over in the west.
Beautiful colours, and they are colourful across Australia in different forms, different trees, different weather climates and so on that each location has. But in the desert there is a stream that does flow, and there is flowers that bloom, and even in the driest places the Sturt Desert Pea comes up. But the wildflowers across the outback of Queensland, New South Wales and South Australia, after all the rains we've had, are absolutely magnificent. And that brings us to a little point that Lisa wants to talk through about what this means in a theological sense.
Yeah, well, actually, Wayne, you just mentioned about streams in the desert, and I couldn't help but quote Isaiah 35. I mentioned earlier, the wilderness and the wasteland shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. Isn't that a beautiful verse? But later on, you mentioned about streams in the desert, and it talks about in this verse, it actually states, the parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water. And I think that that's really exciting, that there are streams in the desert. Even in the desert, there is opportunities, even in difficult circumstances in our lives. We can use this as a metaphor, that perhaps you're going through a desert experience. Well, it's interesting. Cowman, this wonderful book called Streams in the Desert, beloved by the companion Charles E. Cowman. This was written back in the 1920s, and you can get a copy. You can actually go to Koorong and order this particular book. It's actually an excellent devotion, and it refers to how in one of the garden books there's a chapter with very interesting headings called Flowers That Grow in the Gloom. It deals with those patches in the garden which never catch the sunlight. And of course, you can get my gist regarding the situation, regarding our metaphor of life. Sometimes we don't feel as though we are catching the sunlight. And the guide tells the sort of flowers which are not afraid of these dingy corners, they rather flourish in these difficult and adverse situations where they're in the shade. And the similar things in the world of the spirit, they come out when material circumstances become stern and severe. They grow in the gloom. And we sometimes can actually learn through the plants of how resilient we need to be in the face of adversity. And we can gather our strength and our encouragement from creation and what God has made. He's got messages all around for us to see.
I was in Bordertown this week, and the canola flower, which is the seed that we have oil that comes from the seed that is made into the ethanol for fuel and also for cooking, and that is in short supply around the earth because sunflower seed is in short supply out of the Ukraine. And the flowers through Bordertown and Keith are just majestic crops of beautiful golden canola, the same gold that we're talking about with our wattle.
Yes, indeed. And mentioning creation, Lisa, I'm reminded of these words of Paul in Romans chapter 1. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So this means that if our eyes are open, we can look at all of creation, stars, animals, birds, plants, the golden wattle, and discern things about the character of God himself. He's revealing himself through creation. We really need to open our eyes and see the beauty of God's creation. And you mentioned, Lisa, Jesus' Rose of Sharon earlier. I was thinking that the perfume of the rose is greatest when the rose is crushed. And the efficacy of Christ, the power of Christ, was greatest then in that moment when he was dying on the cross to win salvation for us, to pay the price of sin. And there was the rose crushed, but yielding that wonderful perfume and giving us eternal life through his death and resurrection.
It's interesting because across our broadcast regions, different places grow different crops and have different flowers. And it's interesting because we have stone fruit through the Riverland and through Mildura and the Sunraysia. We have a lot of almond orchards all blossoming. In Keith, in the upper southeast of South Australia, we have the lucerne crop with a purple flower, a beautiful purple, a deep purple flower, referring again to the majestic or to, if you like, the royalty, the robes of purple. And then in other locations we have flowering plants like, say, the pumpkin flower, where pumpkins are grown in Queensland, and then the peanuts have a flowering plant too. So each of these foods, that quite often flowers are grasses in the field that feed cattle, but often the flowering plant can be a flower that is fertilised by bees, and then that causes growth in a bulb or something of that nature. And so we see even when onions come up a flower, and this produces food. And I think we never should lose sight of what God's provision is through these flowering plants and through the beautiful bees that pollinate and so forth, that this importance.
Yes, it actually says in Isaiah 55 verse 10, it says, for as the rain comes down and the snow from heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth and make it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater. So shall my word that goes forth from my mouth, it shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I send it.
Well, we've been talking this morning on the Sunday service with David and Lisa and Wayne here about the flowers and the emblems and the significance. It is, of course, spring, and it is this week is the first day of September, which is National Wattle Day, and David's told us a little bit about the symbolisms of that.
And he has to actually tell us what's the official name, the classification name for wattle, David?
That is the Acacia pycnantha.
Oh, wow.
Acacia pycnantha, there we have the golden wattle. It is our national symbol, and it's one that we need to reflect on this week as spring is upon us, but also we reflect on the beauty of God's creation and the floral emblems that are around about us, each state having a floral emblem. But in Australia, we need these fires of affliction to come upon our native forests for these wattle plants to actually have the seed break open under the pressure of the heat of fire, and a lot of other gums too.
And they're dispersed more.
And they then grow into a canopy below the other canopy and replace those large trees when their time comes, where they either cut down or they die through lack of nutrition or water. And so this is part of God's renewing plan.
Symbolism of fire of adversity.
It does. It reminds me, and David, I know that you were talking before about this 1 Corinthians passage, chapter 15, and it begins in verse 37. And Lisa, what does it say?
It says, "And what you sow, you do not sow that body that shall be, but mere grain, perhaps wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he pleases, and to each seed its own body." Wow, what's a little bit of a play on words there, David?
That's right. Well, Paul is explaining to the Corinthians about what's going to happen to all of us. We're all going to die, and we're all going to come back to life again.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful promise. And so he says that this is given to us by way of indication through gardening and through agricultural pursuits. This is why the city dwellers are so much missing out on these truths, and our country cousins have the benefit over the rest of us, because they are handling these things. They are planting seed, and they know this metaphor. You know that what you plant is not what you get. You plant a little black seed, and out of that comes a glorious eucalypt tree or a poppy or a wattle or whatever it might be. And how glorious is that? So God is really giving us an indication as to what's going to happen to us through this agrarian or botanical metaphor. So all plants that spring from seed give testimony not only to Jesus, who died and rose, but to all of us, because we're all going to die and rise.
Yeah.
So I find that very comforting.
Interesting too, because the Apostle Paul talked about the different works that are done by ministers, and he talked about how God had assigned tasks to each minister, that he planted a seed, the Apostle Paul, and then Apollos, another apostle, came along and watered it, but God made it grow. And I think that's the key. God made it grow.
That's right. It says actually in having faith like a mustard seed. And how small is a mustard seed? Do you know, David, how small a mustard seed is?
It is very small indeed, yes.
Yes, one can't actually almost see a mustard seed. It is tiny, but the flower of the mustard is also incredible too. And again, we talk about those colours and giving reference and symbolism. And so the early writers of both Old and New Testament actually were bringing in the natural world to their writing to explain in a metaphor the seed, if you like, of a flower, or the seed of, say, canola, or the seed of wheat, that one would have to plant it, but it has to first die, and then it comes up with new life and grows and produces much more fruit. And they talk, even Jesus talked about the seed producing a 100-fold in some cases. Now, a lot of our wheat farmers take a seed of Scepter, the new seed variety.
That's and the famous word at the moment, isn't it?
Yes,
Scepter?
Scepter seed. It's one that turns very much from very low rainfall into a glorious crop. And they talk about it producing 30 seeds or 60 head seed in the head, or 100 seed in the head if you have a really, really good crop. So Jesus' words and that of the Apostle Paul and of the Old Testament writers are actually quite relevant today when we talk about the floral emblems and the gardens around about us, the fields ripe for harvest before us. We've been talking about the beautiful plants that grow about us, the crops of flowers and the wonderful wattle. It is the first day of spring coming up this week, and the national emblem is the golden wattle. It's been the subject of our discussion today on the Sunday service, and the spiritual and often not understood relevance of God's creation and the plants that are there and the writings about them and how they reflect into our world and into our lives. And we're going to have a look at a passage from the Bible, from Isaiah, Lisa.
Yes, that's right. And in actually it says Isaiah 40, God's people are comforted. And I'm referring to verse 6. It says, the voice said, cry out. And he said, what shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, because the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flowers fade. The grass withers, the flower fades. But the word of our God stands forever.
Yes, it is such important contrast that we see a withering grass around about us, hot northerly winds maybe that are drying out and parching our lands. And with that in mind, that is a symbolism. God has something even greater than these pictures or these reflections, if you like. He has his word, which is the power unto salvation.
Yes, that's right, Wayne, and I really encourage our listeners to share these truths with their children and grandchildren. Wattle Day coming up this Thursday, of course, the 1st of September. Although it's good on any day to wear our national flower, national floral emblem, why not? I refer again to that refrain from Wattle Day of 1916, wear your spray of wattle, as a monarch wears his crown. Its native gold through testing fires has won to high renown. This combination of flood and fire working together to provide the ideal conditions for the wattle. It speaks so much of us, to us, I should say, about Jesus being the first from the dead, and how we too, like seed to be buried in the earth, will sprout afresh to life in Christ. So what a wonderful message that is for our listeners to share with children and grandchildren, especially on this National Wattle Day coming up on Thursday.
Thanks, David, for that reflection, and thank you for joining us in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. You all have your state emblems, but we all are underneath one great Commonwealth emblem, the golden wattle. And for those that are hearing it on a podcast, maybe from Western Australia, Tasmania, the Australian Capital Territory, the Northern Territory or Queensland, or anywhere else around the world, we have enjoyed bringing you a very colourful botanical floral display today on our Sunday service.
It certainly has been delightful.